So today I want to show you how to take a song from this
I will not ask you, and neither would you.
to this.
Honey, just put your sweet lips on my lips.
This is actually a complete run through of a previous production that we did using entirely SM57s. So I would love if you went and checked out that video. That is by far one of the videos I am most proud of. But after this one, and yes, the mixing process can be just as time intensive as the actual recording and production process. So it only makes sense to cover both sides. Also, fair warning, I'm testing out this Lawton Audio LS208, which is a condenser microphone that is meant to have kind of a similar amount of noise rejection as a dynamic microphone. This is a real life test. This is also the daytime. I usually record at night. So if Brooklyn decides to be just a little bit more noisy than usual today, give the mic a break and give me a break. This is not particularly a audio. This isn't particularly about the voiceover chain and the audio coming from my voice. This is about the mix that we're dealing with today. Amazing. Hey, it's nighttime now. It's actually also a different day. Whatever, though. Continuity is dumb. Let's go into Ableton. Okay, so what you're looking at right now is the original session for the SM57 video. For those of you that aren't familiar with Ableton, let me walk you through the kind of the general form of the program. On the right side here, we have all of the different audio channels and their groups. On the bottom here, we have the plugins that we used. And if I were to pull this tab here, we have any plugins, audio effects, or digital instruments that we would want to add. Now this production was all done using recorded sounds. That was part of it. I could only use an SM57. First and foremost, let me walk you through my basic premise on how I set up these sessions. You'll notice here a bunch of different tracks called A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way down to G. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G. These are called parallel processing tracks. Each one of these is going to have a different effect on them. Some of them are fairly straightforward, like reverb and delay, and others of them are called parallel, meaning parallel compression. We'll get into what that means a little bit later, but you'll see here each one of these things is doing something just a little bit different, whether that means it's a different reverb than the default reverb that I'm using, whether that means metatune, which is basically an off-brand version of auto-tune. You'll see why I'm using that here. I'm not actually tuning her voice. Now, if I just tap this little button here, we're going to go to kind of the mixing panel on Ableton. These are all still the same thing. Lead vocal here is the same as lead vocal here. It's just vertical now. And you'll notice A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, just like A, B, C, D, E, F, and G here. This controls the amount of signal that we send to these return tracks. So for now, all I need you to understand is that a lot of the mixing that we're doing in this session is occurring in these return tracks. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take the lead vocal, and for now, I'll turn off all of the effects that are affecting the lead vocal. If we hear it,
Dear, however scary about the night, the bugs and the dirt.
let's hear that without any of the return tracks on.
I had a thought, dear, however scary about the night, the bugs and the dirt. Why were you digging? What did you bury?
Now, part of the reason I find parallel processing, or the act of using return tracks in order to create effects below the actual raw signal, part of the reason I find that so powerful is because we're not doing anything destructive to the original track, and we're adding different levels of flavors that we can mix into taste. Let's just take this parallel compression track for a second. Parallel compression typically means having a pretty compressed signal, much more than you would normally do, in parallel to a less compressed signal. You can then mix in that parallel compression to taste by drawing in how much power you're sending to the parallel track, or by mixing that fader on the return track to a higher or lower volume. So I actually have a separate parallel compression track on the lead vocal than I do for the rest of the instruments. You can see here, if I open this plugin here, we have a pretty intense ratio on this parallel compressor, a ratio of 10:1. What that essentially means is for every 10 decibels that we're getting in, it's squashing it down to 1 decibel out. We're then bringing up the gain a little bit later in order to make that a louder volume. I have a whole video on compression that you can watch because it's a whole can of worms in and of itself. Now you can see some of the techniques I used on her vocal that are not just the parallel compression track, specifically a high pass filter with a really aggressive EQ. Now, what does this actually translate to in terms of what we're doing to the lead vocal? We know it's going to be really bright, and you can see here I ducked out where the sibilance is, and it's going to be really compressed. So we're adding a level of airiness that we wouldn't normally be getting. Let's hear how it sounds with it and without it.
I had a thought, dear, however scary, about the night, the bugs and the... Why were you digging? What did you bury before those hands pulled me from the earth?
So we're doing a little bit more subtle moves now, but you can see if I like boost that level of signal going into the parallel compression track, we're getting much more air. And this is how I like to blend these things to taste. If I were to put that parallel compression signal on the original vocal would be destroyed. But by mixing these things in, I can add whatever flavors under the original track I want while still preserving the initial natural kind of beauty of the original vocal. Okay, let me stop harping on parallel tracks here for a second. I'll just engage all of them again. And let's talk about what's actually happening to the lead vocal. So here's the lead vocal without the plugins on it engaged, with the return tracks though.
Night, the bugs and the dirt. Why were you digging? What did you bury before those hands pulled me from the earth?
So check out the EQ curve I have in this scenario. Pretty weird, I would say. And that's because Ava, the singer in this track, has a pretty bright voice, and I thought this production as a whole needed to be toned down and darker and maybe have kind of a more vintage warmth kind of tone to it. So I didn't add any typical high shelves that you would typically add, and I actually boosted the mid-range. So let's hear the vocal with and without this boost.
Why were you digging? What did you bury before those hands pulled me from the earth?
Next is a compressor.
Ever scary about the night.
We're adding volume here. So yes, we are also compressing it, but we are doing what we call gain staging and adding a little bit of volume in each signal to get to the optimum volume at the end. So yes, it does sound better, but it's not marvelously magically better because it's louder. Now we're also adding fresh air. Fresh air is actually a parallel compression algorithm that they just kind of baked into a plugin. It's a really powerful one though, and if you can really overdo it really quickly. I'm not using any of this mid-range compression here. I'm adding a little bit of high air, which is going to give us just a little bit of breathiness.
Why were you digging? What did you...
You can hear it in like the really high end, 10 to 20K. Next is just a verb suite. Now, I typically don't use a lot of reverb on the actual tracks.
Bury before those hands pulled me from the earth.
You can see here, this is just adding a little bit of a room tone, and also the dry wet knob is sent to only 20% wet.
For those hands pulled me from the earth.
More than anything, this is adding a little bit of stereo width to her vocal. Dynamic EQ, as I've explained in my old EQ video, is a pretty cool and a pretty powerful tool. Now, the way this works is pretty interesting. It's an EQ with the tools and settings of a compressor. Now, what I mean by that is it has a threshold and it has a ratio. So what I can do is decide a specific band of the frequency range and say, once you pass this specific threshold, duck and subtract that frequency range. And we're using it at the 10K in order to get the sibilance out of her voice, like so.
I will not ask you where you came from.
So we're ducking out the S sounds, just getting that harshness out of her voice. And that's really it for the lead vocal. It's an EQ that I used to emphasize the mid-range warmth. My standard compressor set to a pretty standard setting. Fresh air to add a little bit of breath to her voice. We're using the room signal to add a little bit of stereo width, and TDR to clean up the sibilance. And again, a lot of what's happening to her voice is happening through these parallel tracks. One thing that I haven't really mentioned here that's adding a little bit of kind of size to her voice is this metatune thing. This is actually really cool. So I'm not using it in order to pitch her voice at all. I'm just using it in order to make some stereo width by essentially splitting the signal into the stereo fields like such.
Were you digging? What did you bury before those hands pulled me from the
If I wanted to make it more narrow,
I will not ask you where you
it's a
came
doubler,
from.
but it's a doubler set to the extremes of the stereo
Neither
field.
should you. Honey, just put your sweet lips on.
Just like that. So there's also these angelic highs. Super simple. All I did was add a little bit of compression. You can see it's probably only reducing like 3 decibels. Yeah. And I drenched it in reverb and cut out the high end. I can boost the high end if I wanted to here. Or I can darken it. You know, I typically don't put a lot of heavy compression on the signal itself. I leave that to parallel processing. But if I'm doing something stylistic, a supporting role in a song, such as these oohs and ahs that are happening in the chorus, that's when you can get a little bit kind of crazy with these sort of drenching them in reverb or crazy delays. That's where I tend to put a lot of these heavy effects that are set to 100% wet and all that. Right, there's a lot to cover here. Let me just talk about the acoustic guitar for a second. Now, one thing I want to show you guys that I think is really powerful. You'll see here that we have ahs 1, 2, 3, and then like angelic ahs group. Backing vocals 1 and 2, backing vocals group. With the acoustic guitar, we have acoustic guitar 1, acoustic guitar 2, and a group. Now, if you recall from the original video, acoustic guitar 1 and 2, they are 2 different SM57s spread across the stereo field, meaning they're the exact same guitar take, and I decided to process them together. Now, this is a really cool tool and something I really think you guys should do. Let's say you have a number of different signals that all kind of are going to end up being processed the same. Just group them all together and then process the group as a whole. Save yourself some CPU and then also save yourself some time. So with the acoustic guitar, what I ended up doing was putting the same compressor I typically use on. Now this compressor is a little bit interesting. You don't set a ratio on it. The ratio is decided dependent on the input level and the threshold. As it stands, we're only reducing about 2 decibels, really minor. But if I were to push this and then set the threshold to lower, you're going to start to see this reduction meter going a bit crazier. Too intense, too thumpy. Then all I did was add a little bit of a high shelf. I thought the guitar sounded pretty great as it is. And if you remember, these 2 different signals are spread across the right side and the left side of the signal. And one of them is the darker side of the acoustic guitar, and one of them is a brighter sound. Together they make a more holistic, large tonal image. I didn't really have to do much EQing besides that because it's already a pretty nuanced tone as it is just through sheer mic placement. Here's one mic in the center. And 2 mics as a stereo field. Cool. It's really not that complicated. I spent like a lot of effort making this is like the most processing of anything on the whole track is the claps. This is all just kind of BS. I put a low pass filter on it to make them darker. I recorded like 4 claps, staggered them slightly to sound like multiple claps together. Digital clip center and compression and fresh air. I don't know what I was doing, man. Let's see what it sounds like without any of this. I mean, it sounds bigger. Nothing really to note there. Okay, so here's one thing that is a strategy that I think more people need to use. So there is a way to get far more bass out of your bass by using compression. Okay, so let's just look at this compressor for a second. Does anyone notice anything in this compressor that looks different than normal? It's the release. If you notice here, we have pretty standard input levels, pretty standard threshold, but the release is set to be really long. So what that essentially means is whatever processing that we're doing in order to compress that bass is happening for a really long time. We're going to normalize the volume of that bass for, in this case, 4.5 seconds. Now what that means is the decay line of the bass. If we were to check out on the actual track, you can see how the bass decays in volume over time. Well, the compressor is going to stop it from doing that for 4.5 seconds, meaning you're going to end up with more of a sausage than you would a decay tail. And the result is a much more powerful, longer bass drone, like so. And then without it. And one other thing that you might have noticed here is we have another compressor here that is what we call side chained to the kick. And you'll hear that. You'll hear every time that this line starts to come up, this audio clip, you'll hear like a little in the bass. You can see it here too. We're getting a volume reduction that is activated by the kick. Now, this is a pretty standard technique, especially in like EDM. But what we're essentially doing is carving out the low end. So whenever that kick hits, the bass is going to reduce in volume and get out of the way of the kick drum, making the kick drum sound more clear, full, and present. But as soon as that kick is done hitting, we stop reducing volume on the bass, and the bass takes prominence once again. Let's hear those two together. Just like that. For the electric guitar, I have an emulator on it. That's about it, I think. Yep, I have some chorus, a tremolo, and a 7-band EQ dipping out the mid-range, as well as a bit of a high-end boost on an EQ. And then the standard Fairchild emulator that I use all the time, and fresh air. So whenever we go to export this, we can do one of two different things. We can make a mastering chain to export within the song itself, or we can take the mix into a separate file and make a mastering chain there. Mastering is a lot to talk about, but I'm going to give you like a little crash course on what I did here. This is not super scientific. This isn't up to like normal LUFS levels. It might be. It's probably louder for those of you who understand that terminology. But really all I did was I went into mastering and I chose the acoustic balance, and then I tweaked a little bit. So we're getting a little bit more low end. We're getting a little bit more high end, and the mid range is just a little bit understated. Let's see how that sounds with just the EQ on the mastering chain off and on.
There is someone that died long ago, so I will not ask you why you were creeping in some sad way. I already
Mostly just more presence in the low end. And then we go to our mastering compressor. Now, if you guys have never heard of Kotelnikov, comes from Tokyo Dawn Research, which is the same people that make the TDR Nova, which is what we used on the voice to control sibilants. They make a beautiful mastering compressor. And you can see here, if we just go into the settings, I just chose one of their settings, if I'm honest. They have really great presets. And it's just doing maybe 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction. Important to note here, whenever we compress a mastering chain, we don't want to do too drastic of a move. And that goes for everything on a mastering chain. Remember that whatever you happen to do on an EQ, on a mastering chain, whatever you happen to do on a compressor on a mastering chain, you're affecting everything. So if you decide to boost the upper mid range, maybe you're trying to get more vocal presence, remember you're drawing presence from the vocal, but you're also drawing presence from the guitar, the kick, the bass, everything. So whatever we happen to do on the mastering chain, make sure it's subtle, and all these subtle moves will begin to add up. Next, I have a virtual tape machine, just adding a little bit of kind of granular warmth to it. It's kind of a warm distortion. I'll show you what it sounds like if you kind of really stress out the plugin. You'll get kind of a more exaggerated version of what's happening because it's, again, really subtle because it's a mastering chain. Hear how it's crushing the signal? And then finally, one of my favorite plugins, Gullfoss, and we're using the mastering version. Gullfoss is an intelligent EQ that in real time measures for resonant frequencies that are deemed within the parameter it's given to be overly resonant or maybe not resonant enough, and then it either brings in or decreases those signals based off of the parameters that you give it. I really, really like this style of plugin because rather than a destructive EQ that will constantly and forever be on and forever boosting or cutting that signal, it will only do so when it is necessary.
I had a thought, dear, however scary, about the night, the bugs and the dirt. Why were you digging? What did you bury before those hands pulled me from the earth?
So let's hear that mastering chain if I were to turn it all off and back on.
Just kiss like real people do. I knew that look, dear, eyes open.
And that's it. Typically, if you're just exporting from a mix file like this rather than a full guaranteed mastering chain, you might add a limiter. My mix wasn't clipping. It sounded relatively natural as it was, so I left it as it was. A limiter will make sure it peaks at a specific volume level, maybe -6 dBFS, which is what this one is peaking at, but without going above it and clipping. The way it does that is essentially anything that reaches a certain threshold will be compressed to high heaven. It just won't let it pass. But we didn't need that here. And you know, I don't want you to think that this mastering chain that I have here is like the science of mastering. There's a lot more, especially because you're gonna want to meet a certain specified loudness level, which is measured in something that we call LUFS. And this loudness level will basically indicate how well these kinds of mixes will perform on certain streaming platforms. It's a whole can of worms. But for now, this is all I needed, and I hit export. Okay, so guys, I hope that helped answer the question as to how I mixed this production. I know a lot of you guys were curious. What it boils down to is really proper mic placement with the guitar and dynamic microphones, specifically stereo recording two different kind of unique timbres. And kind of my secret weapon that I use all the time is parallel processing, all those flavors on the return tracks. Anyways, you can follow me on Instagram at RealAudioHaze. If you'd like to work on a project with me, you can email me at realaudiohaze@gmail.com.